It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us back on the show to give us a little boost here as we finish up our Lent and give us something to think about is Rick Becker. Thanks for being here, Rick.
Thanks, Kyle. It's glad to be here.
You recently posted another article on the National Catholic Register website talking about Moses's horns, which some people might not know about. Do people ever look at you funny whenever you talk about the horns of Moses?
Yes, especially my students. I teach at Bethel College, and the vast majority of my students are Protestant Christians. And this is, I mentioned in the article, a peculiarly Catholic phenomenon. And it's one that you can readily see yourselves if you next time you visit Notre Dame, because it's Moses has horns all over the place at Notre Dame. Here's the story for those who don't know it. When St. Jerome translated the scriptures into Latin in the 4th century, the word for shining is also the word for horn. So there's a moment in Exodus, I think in Exodus 34, I believe, where Moses is coming down from Mount Sinai with tablets of the law. And in the Hebrew scriptures, it says that he was radiant, or he had light shining from his face. But that also could be translated as horns. And for whatever reason, St. Jerome chose to use the word horn instead of shining or rays of light. And that consequently became the basis for many, many depictions of Moses in art and sculpture and painting throughout the Middle Ages and up into the modern period. So that, again, if you go to Notre Dame and you look above the main altar at the transept, you'll see the 4 evangelists, and you'll see 4 of the Old Testament prophets, and there's Moses holding the tablets of the law, and he's got 2 horns of light shining out of his head. And the best example is the one on campus near the library where you see First Down Moses statue, where he's pointing up with that one finger in the air, and the students call it the First Down Moses. But he has literal animal horns sticking out of his head.
Yeah. And probably the most famous is Michelangelo's Moses, which, again, has these horns sticking out. And I don't quite get it. I mean, even if you're reading the scriptures and you're reading St. Jerome's translation and you see that he has horns, it's such a minor part of the life of Moses. And I wouldn't think, okay, I'm depicting Moses in a statue made out of marble. I've got to include these horns because that's in Exodus chapter 34. Why does that become such a focal point of so many artists throughout the years?
Well, I do think it's out of, and whether or not it's an actual translation is another matter, which we can talk about as well. But I do think it's out of a healthy respect for the biblical tradition, so that the artisans who are trying to be faithful to the biblical record, that if it was in Exodus, if the writer of Exodus, inspired by the Holy Spirit, chose to mention that it was important enough to mention that he came down from Mount Sinai with the horns on his head, that somehow that was important enough to include it in the pictures, even if they didn't have a theological understanding of why that might be important. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some indications, as I mentioned in my post on the Register, that even in the Jewish tradition going back prior to the time of Jerome, that there were reasons why that translation of horns really was something that was accurate, that it was an appropriate translation. And different commentators that I found have said that perhaps it was an indication of authority, and it was in some ways a mirror. I mean, when Moses was coming down off the mountain with the 10 Commandments, it was at the time when the Jewish people were worshiping a golden calf that also had horns, so that it may have been a mirror, that whereas instead of worshiping this horned animal, that you should listen to me, that I have a authority that's even greater, and it comes from God. So that there might have been a reason for it to actually be translated as horns. But I do think it's out of a healthy respect for the biblical tradition. And regardless, I do think it is amusing, which is the point of my piece, or the post. I think it's amusing that going forward, now all modern translations translate Exodus 34 as shining or radiant or glowing, that Moses came down after encountering having had that epiphany moment, that encounter with God, that theophany, that he came down glowing as a result. It was like a borrowed glory that was accompanying him as he was coming down with the law. But what I spend most of the time in the post talking about is this irony that St. Jerome, who we think of as being the father of biblical translation, is going to be remembered forever as being responsible for this goof, or an apparent goof of mistranslation. So every time anyone sees a Moses with horns, they think, "Oh, well, that was just Jerome's goof." Right. And yet, St. Jerome is a saint, of course, and he did do much more than just translate that one word from Hebrew to Latin. And I use it as a jumping-off point to think about the Last Judgment, and that in some respects we too will be at the Last Judgment. Our goofs or apparent goofs are going to be on display for all the world, and yet if we die in grace, if we die in friendship with God, then it won't matter. That won't matter. Same as St. Jerome, I'm sure, in heaven is not worried about the fact that when I go to Notre Dame, I tell my students that, look, there's a mistranslation up there on the ceiling, that St. Jerome has more important things to do right now as he's enjoying the beatific vision for all eternity.
Yeah.
And that hopefully that will be where we are as well when it comes time for the Last Judgment.
We're talking with Rick Becker about this article that he wrote for the National Catholic Register. You can find it at ncregister.com. It's Glorious Exposure of Moses' Horns, St. Jerome, and the Last Judgment. And can you talk a little bit about what the Last Judgment is?
Yes. So as I told you in my our previous conversation, we'll actually experience, as part of the four last things, we talk about judgment, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, and that there are actually two judgments. There's a particular judgment at the moment of our death, which will determine our eternal destiny, either heaven or hell. But at the end of time, in association with the resurrection of the dead and the joining of our souls with our resurrected bodies, there will be this final judgment, or last judgment, in which it will be an accounting for all the cosmos to witness of God's superintendence of history and each individual's part that he played, not just in a general sense, but also very specific. It'll be, in a sense, a rehearsal for all the cosmos to witness of our lives and how our lives are intertwined with God's superintendence of history and bringing about the kingdom. And as I tried to talk about in the piece, when I think about that, and I think about how I try to live my life every day, and how I try to live out the sacraments and live out the faith, I don't want to live my life in fear of what people are going to see at the end of time, because my particular judgment at the moment of my death is just between me and God. But that last judgment at the end of time is going to be for everyone to see. So at a kind of a lower level, I want to live my life in such a way that, with an awareness that it will all be exposed as a glorious exposure at the end of time. But if I'm living my life and trying to live the sacraments that I receive, especially confession and the Eucharist on a regular basis, that, like St. Jerome, it won't matter, because I'll be so focused on Jesus, that I'll be so focused on trying to be one with him and conform to him, that all of my past misdeeds and mistakes and goofs won't matter. And that's the goal. The goal isn't just to avoid embarrassment at the Last Judgment, but also to be so in tune with the Trinity, so taken up into that beatific vision, that it just won't matter. It just won't matter. And that we can just sit back and enjoy watching that. A friend of mine recently, he made reference to the idea that it'll be like the drive-in at the end of the world, in which we get to see everybody's role that we played and how God was building his kingdom and bringing it about, and we can just sit back and enjoy it as we're relaxing in our eternal reward.
Yeah, so how would you suggest that we reflect on this, especially as we end Holy Week here with the Triduum? What are some things that we should be keeping in mind, keeping in prayer as we reflect on these things?
Wow. I think it's just that, as I talk about in our previous conversation about the four last things, that the four last things, death, judgment, heaven or hell, ought to be in the forefront of our minds. We shouldn't just think about it at the end of our lives, but we should be thinking about those things on a daily basis, and should, in a sense, form the framework in which we make decisions, when we make choices, and we choose to forego things or choose to embrace things based on this idea that it's all oriented to that end. And we want to be enthusiastically moving toward our end. Again, not in a morbid way, as I mentioned several times in our last conversation, but in a very positive way, that we are destined for heaven, and we don't want to do anything that's going to get in the way of that. So that's what I would. That's what I try to do anyway.
Yeah. Well, check that out. If you missed the last time we talked, it's episode 661. You can find that talking about death, judgment, heaven, and hell. The 4 last things, which are actually 3 things, and I think you talked about the 10 things of the 4 things that are actually 3 things. So definitely listen
the
to that.
The math gets tricky.
Yeah. So just to satisfy my curiosity on this whole debate, horns or rays of light, what do you think is the accurate translation there?
Wow. Well, you're speaking to a nursing instructor, not a biblical scholar.
Okay.
I guess I'm going to go with the modern translators. I do reference in there the Dewey Reams, which was a 19th century English translation of the Vulgate, does include horns. But pretty much virtually all modern translations, including like the Revised Standard and the New American Bible that we use in the liturgy, all use the word rays of light. So I'm going to go with the rays of light. And just to bring this back full circle, if you go to Notre Dame and you look above the transept, above the main altar, you're going to see that those horns coming out of Moses' head really are rays. So it's almost like that artist split the difference. But I'm going to go with the modern scholars and think that the better translation is rays of light.
All right, sounds good. Hey, check out this article. It's called Glorious Exposure of Moses' Horns, St. Jerome, and the Last Judgment. A great thing to reflect on here. It's available at ncregister.com. Where can people find more of your work, Rick?
They can go, if they Google God Haunted Lunatic, you're going to find a lot of my stuff, and I hope you find it edifying and helpful.
Good. God Haunted Lunatic. Check it out. So much great stuff. Thanks so much for joining us today, and
Thank you,
give
Kyle.
us a little extra boost for our Holy Week. Appreciate it.
All right. Happy Easter.